Well, I'd like to welcome everyone for coming tonight. And it's kind of a nice night not to have to be out. It's kind of damp, wet, rainy fall night, the kind you want to just cuddle up with a nice hot dinner and a good story to listen to. And that is exactly what we have tonight. An intriguing story to hear about our own world history that we so seldom look at or think about. And so I'm very excited. Tonight's program is being brought to us by the Fred Birch Senior Foundation. And it is a wonderful group, a wonderful family from West Michigan that believes in using service to promote American citizenship and their wonderful service to their community and to their country. And their family has a long history of it. And we're very proud to have them as our sponsors. They're West Michigan natives, and both Fred and Lorraine have spent their entire life in public service. And without them, our lectures this evening would not be possible. We're very excited that they're here with us right now. And we also have one of our sponsors is Blue Lake Public Radio. They're our media sponsor. And we're very happy to have them as our media sponsor. And we're excited that we're having our wonderful Professor Fred Johnson speaking to us tonight. It's been an exciting journey to get to this point. When we started out the season, before 7, and just as the light came on at the end of World War II, and everyone was looking forward to peace, prosperity, and happiness across the board from everyone, the world kind of took a dark turn. And it became a scary place to be in the Cold War because we didn't really know what was. A lot of the people in the military and the government understood what was going on. But as a society, people just didn't see this war that was going on in the shadows and behind. And so tonight we'll be looking at the origins of some of those things, and we're very excited. It looks like everyone has been admitted. And with that, I will turn it over to Fred. As with all of our evening programs, you will all be muted until the end of the program. And then if you have any comments that you would like to make or questions that you would like to ask, if it's during the presentation, please put it in the chat box and I will let Fred know. And if it's at the end of the program, I will unmute everyone and we will have a free discussion at the end. If there's any, if not, then I will turn it over to Fred. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peg. And your introduction, as always, was spot on. Thank you for that. And hello, scholars of the Silverside Museum Education Historical Program. This subject that we're going to cover tonight is nothing short of fascinating. When Peg mentioned that at the end of World War II, with all the hope and the optimism, not to mention the sheer relief of the fact that the war in Europe was over, the war in the Pacific was over, but there were wars that had been happening inside of wars that made the ending of World War II just a curtain raise, just a precursor to the many conflicts that were going to be happening during that period called the Cold War from 1945 to 1990. If anything, the end of World War II, particularly the Pacific War, was just an accent, just a small pause in a larger conflict that had been going on since the late 1920s and all through the 1930s and obviously into the 1940s that had been happening in China. Now, this first slide you see here, which shows a typical representation of the American flag against the communist flag, particularly the flag of the Soviet Union, we think very often that the Cold War was against the United States and the Soviet Union, that is East versus West, and it was. But we need to go ahead and enlarge our vision because instead of it being just against the Soviet bear and the American bald eagle, that's a good looking eagle, isn't it? Instead of it being just the Soviet bear and the American bald eagle, there also was that nation called China. Now, China in the 1940s was led by Mao Zedong, and that occurred after a very long and just bitter struggle against Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist Chinese, also known as the Kuomintang, that have been going on since, as I mentioned, the 1920s. But before we can actually get into what happened in the conflict between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, we got to go back and take a look at where China had been in the earlier part of the century. And to do that, let's take first things first. And by that, I mean, we got to take a look at that period of imperialism in the early 20th century and establish some context. Because so much of what happened in China in the decades after the 19 teens, especially after World War I, would have had so much to do with what had been happening in China before World War I. So let's start with the 19th century. The 19th century had been the age of what's called the age of imperialism. And to use as an example of that, not so much imperialism in China as it would be in China, but in the nation, or rather the continent, not the nation, but the continent of Africa. If you look at this map of Africa in 1880, you'll see that except for in North Africa, where you have Morocco, Algeria, and what becomes Libya, then eventually Egypt, Africa is pretty much devoid of European powers or European colonization. But if you look at this map of Africa by 1914, look at how the situation has changed. You have Belgium, which dominates the central part of Africa, the Belgian Congo. France has an entire swath of West Africa and Central Africa. The British have a significant part of Northwest Africa and East Africa, to include British East Africa. Today is called Kenya and Tanzania. The Germans were involved in East Africa. The Germans were in Cameroon or on the Bight of Benin. So you have Belgium, France, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, Spain, even Portugal got involved in colonizing West Africa. So to understand what was going on in China at the time and why the Chinese will react so strongly to foreign presence and foreign intervention, we must understand that for decades, and in some cases even centuries, the Chinese have been dominated by various factions, all seeking to rule against the Chinese people. But by the 20th century, that desire to rule over or have spaces of what they call spheres of influence was all the more pronounced, given the international competition. So again, these two maps of Africa before 1880 or by 1880, and then Africa after 1880, shows that the European powers, and this would include not just the European powers, but also the United States, had embarked upon ventures and quests of imperialism, colonization. And just as the continent of Africa was eventually dominated, except for Liberia and West Africa, which was more or less an American outpost. Liberia, of course, was that nation where Black Americans had left in the 19th century and gone there and established the nation of Liberia, with the capital being Monrovia, named after James Monroe, the American president. Their flag is red, white. They have red and white stripes, a blue field with a single white star. It is very much an outpost in West Africa of the United States. And the only other nation that was not conquered by the Europeans was Ethiopia. Now, just as Europeans were interested in colonizing Africa, they also made inroads into Asia. To give you an idea of how dynamic this period was, it truly was rather remarkable. It was a tragic period. It was a brutal period. People were conquered by force. But this particular diagram or picture right here shows Cecil Rhodes, for whom the nation Rhodesia will be named after him. He's called the greatest colonizer of the age. Cecil Rhodes is standing from the top of Africa to the very bottom of Africa. And again, as I mentioned, you see here that even Uncle Sam, holding that flag there, is planting flags in Hawaii, the Caroline Islands, Alaska, the Philippine Islands, and the Philippines gets us into Asia, but also Puerto Rico, the Canary Islands. By 1898 or by 1900, American imperial possessions as a result of the 1898 Spanish-American War included, or we obviously had the West Coast of the United States, which made America a Pacific nation anyway because of the West Coast. But we also have in our position by 1898, the Hawaiian Islands, Midway, Wake, Guam, the Philippine Islands. All these places will be the site of future battles against the Japanese into the 20th century. Now, colonization in Africa and in Asia was a pretty touchy kind of thing. And what happened was that by 1874, European powers were vying for domination of Africa so much, and they were so frenetic, and they were so dynamic in what they're making their land claims, there was a possibility of warfare breaking out on the continent. So in 1885, Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, called all the European powers together to sit down at a conference in Berlin, and it was called the Berlin Conference of 1885, to figure out a way to have a more rational system of dividing up the continent of Africa. And again, I'm using the continent of Africa to help explain what eventually happened in China. Here you see Otto von Bismarck, they called him the Iron Chancellor, greeting other European power, other leaders and diplomats from Europe as they came to Berlin to sit down to figure out how they were going to carve up that continent. Now this right here, political cartoons always tell a raw truth. You can see how England is out there grabbing up Gibraltar, is going after Jamaica, Canada, India, Egypt. They said Britain had an empire that the sun never went down on, and it didn't, because Britain had possessions in Asia, in Africa, in Indonesia, all around the world, and obviously formerly North America. This is another cartoon showing how even the Turks and the Russians were involved in the great land grab. And you'll see that as far as the Russians are concerned, in their grab bag, they're reaching right over Asia. Over here, the Germans had their eye on Africa, and the British are just looking at everything. Another sample of how European powers were grabbing up, just going after territory around the world, continent after continent. When it came to Asia, if you look at Central Asia, meaning Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And then of course there was China and Mongolia. A similar thing will be happening in China and in Asia relative to colonization as was taking place or had been taking place in Africa. You can see here the zones of influence in Asia by Great Britain, France, Japan, the United States, the Netherlands, Russia, Portugal. The thing to remember is this: the Chinese had a long history of conflict internally and external forces trying to dominate them. So when the wars began between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek in the 1930s about who's going to dominate, this long history of foreign meddling and foreign domination is not going to be far in the rearview mirror of either one of those leaders, but particularly Mao Zedong, who wants an independent China that's ruled by the Communist Party. This picture right here gives you an idea of just exactly what the Chinese situation was during the age of colonization. Look at that. The Chinese dragon is either dead or knocked out, and fighting over it is Russia, Austria, the British Lion, Germany. Everyone's trying to get a piece of China, of the Chinese mainland. This is another demonstration, not too flattering, of course, of the Queen Victoria, the German Kaiser, and everybody, and some other people, even the Japanese down here in the right foreground, fighting over what to do with China. And again, similar to Otto von Bismarck, who was carving up that cake of Africa. In this instant, it looks like they're carving up a pizza of China. And of course, the gentleman in the background, that caricature of someone who's from China, who's appalled at what's going on. In the 20th century, what happened was that China will eventually be dominated by Mao Zedong, or as some people know him, Mao Zedong. He's born in 1893 and dies in 1976. But Mao, one of the greatest murderers of the 20th century, is going to be in alliance for a moment with Joseph Stalin, another murderer of the 20th century, who's born in 1878 and dies in 1953. These three men, Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, and Adolf Hitler, are going to cause some of the most radical change in Asia and Europe that the world had ever witnessed. Added to their number, just for good measure, Benito Mussolini. So you have these common denominator features of China, which has this long history of colonial intrusion and in many cases colonial domination. And that the resentment from that, very similar to the external resentment that the Nazis would have or that Hitler would have because of what happened to Germany after World War I when the Weimar Republic was imposed from the outside, democracy from the top down, which always has a questionable kind of credibility when people are handed democracy by force instead of going for it themselves. But those resentments, long rooted in histories of inner conflict and external meddling or external domination, those kinds of things are what will drive Mao Zedong, Adolf Hitler, and Joseph Stalin all to be the kind of men that they were, to be in constant conflict inside their countries, but also with the world. Mao Zedong's, for a moment, he has an ally in Chiang Kai-shek, who is a leader of a group of people called the Nationalist Chinese, or the Kuomintang, or the KMT. By 1928, China's had been mostly united under Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong both were young, rising leaders in their respective parts of the country. And when I say mostly united, Chiang Kai-shek had managed to unite most of the country because there were these people called warlords, generals who had their own nationalistic ambitions, who each had vast swaths of territory under their control. But by 1928, most of those warlords had either agreed to follow or had been brought under heel by Chiang Kai-shek. Mao Zedong, to some extent, had helped him do that. So when he establishes that, they set up a new capital in Nanjing. The warlords were still hesitant, though, to follow Chiang. Like I said, they had their own little regions, not little, but rather large regions that they were in control of. And quite frankly, some of these men had vaulting ambition. They wondered, why should they follow Chiang when they were just as good, if not better than he was? So Chiang Kai-shek had control over China, but it was very, very tentative. And it became even more tentative when the Japanese started getting aggressive in the 1930s and expanded their aggression into Manchuria and then eventually attacked China outright in 1937. Added to Chiang Kai-shek's challenges was the fact that there was not just a belief, but there was an insurgent Chinese Communist Party that was becoming more and more dynamic, wanting to have the communists sway over the entire mainland. Now, I tell you, putting this program together is always wonderful to look into history, because just when you think you know that enough that there is to know about a thing, you find out so much more. Chiang Kai-shek, even though he was a nationalist, he had been receiving backing from Joseph Stalin as a means of the Russians getting a foothold inside of China. After all, the one thing that the Bolsheviks, of whom Joseph Stalin had been one, they wanted to spread the revolution from Russia to around the world. And Chiang Kai-shek, being a leader, had been happy to get arms and training from Joseph Stalin to bring the mainland China under his control. This picture right here shows us that for a brief period of time, Chiang and Mao were working together. But as Chiang Kai-shek later found Mao Zedong considered him to be more and more of a threat, the Kuomintang eventually started waging war on Mao Zedong, and the communists had to flee into the wilderness areas for something that eventually became known as the Long March. So there you have it. Chiang had more influence in the urban areas, towns, and cities, whereas in the countryside, where the communists were, they had more influence among the peasantry. Now, eventually what will happen before this is all over with, that the communist Chinese are going to have more credibility among the millions of peasants, and Chiang Kai-shek will not. More than that, during World War II, Chiang Kai-shek will become allied with America and the West. And that connection right there is going to have him distanced from the common Chinese peasant. And that right there will also give Mao an opportunity to get more peasants on his side, so that when the war finally ends, when the two of them go back to the civil war, Chiang Kai-shek is going to have a hard time getting any kind of support whatsoever in the countryside. So bear with me as I read. Life was very hard in communist-controlled area of the countryside. In the 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek launched a series of campaigns against the communists. 1933 was the most severe assault that was initiated. Hundreds of planes were used, flown by American, Canadian, and French pilots. Now, you know, we're used to hearing about American pilots in China during World War II. The ones who flew with Claire Chennault, they were called the Flying Tigers. And we're also used to hearing about American pilots who flew in England during the Battle of Britain. They were called the Eagle Squadron. But I'll be honest with you, I was not totally aware of the fact that American, Canadian, and French pilots had been flying for the nationalist Chinese as early as 1933. And the thing that's also significant about 1933, that's the same year that Adolf Hitler will be asked to become the Chancellor of Germany. When Chiang Kai-shek launches those attacks against the communists and Mao Zedong will have to leave out of their area of sanctuary and move on and be a constant maneuver from 1933, 34, 35 as something that became known as the Long March. The Long March lasted for a long time over a broad range of terrain features and climates. So many people were lost. It was brutal, it was hard, it was difficult. But later on, Mao Zedong will use this Long March in propaganda to demonstrate or to say that that was the incident where the fortunes of the communist Chinese changed, where they were able to establish links with more peasantry, get more of them on their side, and bring some credibility and power to the revolution that was to come. Let's take a brief look at this clip.
A whole army was breaking away. The path of hundreds of thousands of Chinese communists led to uncertainty. Their leader was Mao Zedong. His aim, to make a united Red China.
The Long March was pretty hard, but we were convinced that we were fighting for a good cause and that we would win.
They fought their way through 11 cantons. Meanwhile, their enemies, the nationalists, were after them. A fight of 10,000 kilometers. Against the power of nature as well. They had to cross 24 running rivers in summer clothes, canvas shoes, and straw sandals. They went across 18 snow-capped mountains. Moorlands. Only every 10th survived.
We were starving terribly on the steppes. We were eating wild plants, roots, and grass. Some of them were poisonous. A lot of our fellow soldiers were poisoned.
A march which became a legend. 14 days later, Mao's troops arrived to the new headquarters in North China. Caves at the Yellow River. Mao worked out the principles of the Chinese Marxism here. The former librarian assistant wanted to achieve a big unity of masses. He demanded continuous revolution. Mao's thoughts later mean the religion of a nation of 1 billion people. The era of revolution began in 1911 in China. The army made a coup d'etat against the Caesar. Men cut their braids, the symbol of revolution. China became a republic. But the real dominants were the warlords, the local generals. The nationalists and communists allied and won with joint efforts led by Chiang Kai-shek. But Chiang Kai-shek did not trust the Red comrades because they wanted a different China. Thousands of communists were executed. The survivors ran south, where a new Soviet republic was being founded. The leader was Mao Zedong, the learning years of a dictator.
He used to be a farmer as well. He spoke our language, knew our mentality, knew our character. He was very talented and moved the farmers very well.
Summer 1934, nationalists encircled Mao's troops, but they managed to break out. The Long March began. Summer 1937, Japan attacked China. The common enemy eliminated internal conflict. After 1945, the slaughter continued. The nationalists and communists kept on fighting for power. Mao was supported by most of the Chinese people. His enemies were supported by the US. In the beginning of 1949, the Chiang Kai-shek government moved to Taiwan. The fight for China was over. The Long March achieved its goal. Mao won. Peking, Square of Heavenly Peace, 1st of October 1949. Mao proclaimed the Chinese People's Republic. Mao wanted to make communists out of all Chinese. The continuous revolution became a state doctrine. First step, agrarian reform. The fields of richer farmers were taken away, a lot of them even killed. Their property was divided among 120 million poorer farmers. 1957, experiment with intellectuals. With the motto of "Let 100 flowers blossom," the party president called upon critics. Critics arrived. Mao struck back.
In those times, in 1957, there were only about 5 million white-collar workers in China. Mao condemned about 500,000 of them as illegal anti-revolutionist. For example, I was deported to Chinese Siberia.
Mao was almighty. The propaganda simply called him the Red Sun. In 1958, he ordered the big jump forward from socialism to communism.
We made a huge and very important step, a step which none of our ancestors could do.
Mao's motto, "Down with the Soviet model." Chinese people had to build their country with their own hands. Heavy industry was ignored. The big jump forward turned out to be a step backwards. In the beginning,
There are several things, there's a few things I'd like to point out that we might have missed or that it's too easy to miss in that video. The first thing concerned the Long March. If you look at that map on the right side of the screen, as I say, the communists went over hundreds of miles of territory with the nationalist Chinese pursuing them. This is an actual civil war going on before the actual war launched by the Japanese takes place. So you have maneuver going on. And what I wanted to point out, which the video did not mention, Mao Zedong's stature as a leader rose during that period. And also the camaraderie and the cohesion of the communists among each other, that long period of common risk-taking and common suffering, like in a military unit or in a family, or when two people go through something together, or when a unit of people go through something together, that binds them into a stronger force. They become all the more determined. They become they cohere all the more. They become all the more like-minded and ready to support each other and determined to win. So that's the first thing. The video also pointed out that before the Long March, that the Russians had considered the area where Mao Zedong was headquartered as another Soviet republic. We need to remember that the USSR stood for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. One of them, for example, was Georgia. Georgia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, all these different republics that are independent countries today were all part of the USSR. So the mere fact that the Russians, Joseph Stalin, who came to power after the struggle at the Lenin's death in 1924, Vladimir Lenin dies in 1924. In the subsequent power struggle, Joseph Stalin wins and banishes Leon Trotsky, the brains and the spirit of the Bolshevik Revolution and founder of the Red Army, banishes from the country, and Trotsky eventually flees to Mexico City, where Stalin in 1940 sent secret agents and put an axe in the middle of his head. So Stalin was a lethal character, but so was Mao Zedong. But the point here is that the area where Mao Zedong was, Joseph Stalin considered that to be yet just another extension of the greater Soviet Union, although Mao had his own ideas. That's why I thought it was important for us to have at least that background on the Chinese and the external presence of foreign powers that had been in China long before Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek ever became issues for the Chinese nation.
Beginning of the 60s,
Now, in 1931, the Japanese created an incident called the Mukden incident. If you look over here on the right side, you see the Chinese Eastern Railway. It was there on a rail line that a train blew up, killing some Japanese soldiers, and the Japanese used that as a reason, as an excuse to attack Manchuria. They attacked it and renamed it Manchukuo, naming it a puppet state. It was the first of what became a series of atrocities that the Japanese would commit against the Manchurian people and against the Chinese people, and that would occur in Shanghai in 1937. In the summer of 1937, the Japanese invaded Shanghai, and for 6 weeks, they raped, pillaged, plundered, did some of the most terrible things, committed some of the most awful crimes for the period that we call World War II. I would go into that, but we spent, I think a couple of weeks ago, we dealt with that, and what eventually happened because of the Japanese crimes at Nanking or Shanghai and elsewhere, those crimes would be answered and addressed at the International Military Tribunal of the Far East, or the IMTFE. So clearly, Japanese aggression in China meant that Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek had to suspend the war between each other because, as the video pointed out, there was the common enemy of the Japanese. And then Pearl Harbor came. December 7th, 1941. The Japanese had bitten off more than they could chew in a very big way. And now with the United States on the side of the nationalists, it became natural then that Chiang Kai-shek was an ally or in alliance with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, quite frankly, people inside the United States, many of Roosevelt's advisors, either didn't like Chiang Kai-shek or didn't trust him because he was a corrupt individual, or they just didn't think he was too smart. Either way, the relationship between the United States, Roosevelt's advisors, and Chiang Kai-shek was kind of rocky. On the other hand, Joseph Stalin was all too ready and all too willing to give support to Mao Zedong and his communists still out there in the field. As far as the Japanese were concerned, they will eventually be defeated. And then another thing that will find Joseph Stalin cozying up even closer to Mao Zedong is because during World War II, the German army invades the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. On the left panel, you see these American soldiers landing on D-Day, June 6, 1944. That D-Day landing, Operation Overlord, the liberation of Europe, Joseph Stalin had been asking for a second front to take the pressure off of the Soviet people and the Red Army from the day that the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. In fact, he suspected In Winston Churchill's History of the Second World War, I forgot which volume, but Churchill writes how he understood that Stalin had a deep distrust of the West and that he'd been asking for a second front year after year after year, and thought that the Western powers, meaning the United States and Great Britain, were simply letting the Germans do their dirty work to try and eliminate the Soviet Union, stop the revolution. And so Stalin kept on asking for that second front, and he finally got it on June 6, 1944. The suspicion that Stalin had that he was simply being left to die or twist in the wind by the Americans and the British did not help for relations later on, particularly in the post-war world when there was a Sino-Soviet alliance. Winston Churchill was also of the opinion that Franklin Delano Roosevelt never truly understood how devious and cynical and dangerous Joseph Stalin was compared to FDR, himself a skilled politician. As you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in the spring of 1945. And as per our constitutional system, his vice president, Harry Truman, rose to take the oath of office and became the 33rd president of the United States. Truman was not even aware, had not even been made aware of a program called the Manhattan Project, the development of a super secret weapon that supposedly could bring an immediate end to the conflict in the Pacific. In the years after the cessation of hostilities in the Pacific, something arose among American policymakers. They called it the domino theory. Bear with me as I read, because for a good part of the 1950s and into the 1960s, but definitely into the 1950s, it was believed by American policymakers that communism would proceed in the following way. For example, China's entry into the Korean War may be only a diversion, with French Indochina, also known as Vietnam, as the real goal for conquest. Red-held or communist-held Korea would point a dagger at Japan. Chinese invasion of Korea was matched by intensified campaign in Indochina. So it was true that the Chinese were backing the communists in Indochina or French Indochina, but then they said that if the Chinese succeeded in Korea, what that also then meant was that there would be an invasion of Tibet, maybe a move to solidify Red China's borders with India as well. Indochina was the key to take over Burma, Thailand, Malaya, and perhaps Indonesia, and maybe go down under communism, either by military conquest or internal revolt. The other part of the map saw the communist surge moving from the Chinese mainland out to Japan. Here it says, Chinese Reds have not lost hope of seizing Formosa, Taiwan, where the nationalists eventually fled in 1949 after Chiang Kai-shek was kicked off the mainland. If they do seize Formosa, they pierce General MacArthur's Japan, Philippines defense arc, posing a threat to Okinawa and the Philippines. That was significant because at that point, the Americans had established a military base on Okinawa, an island that during World War II was the scene of vicious fighting. Now it was a forward outpost for maintaining China in the Pacific. And then down here, finally, communist-held Indonesia, Indochina would also put the Reds on the flank of the Philippines. Now, this was every time I see this map, this was of great interest to me because I think I told you all before that I spent the first half of my childhood in the Philippines. So this map shows us just how preoccupied American planners, and frankly, Western planners were with the possible maneuvering of communist China in the early days of the Cold War, let's say from 1945 until 1955, 1954, 1955, 1954, 1955, being that year when the communist Vietnamese will defeat the French at a place called Dien Bien Phu, opening up another chapter, a brand new chapter for what eventually happens in the place that we now know of as Vietnam. So Chiang Kai-shek, who's lost the support of the Chinese people and is not very well liked or trusted by the Americans, will be kicked off the mainland. Now, this is just a quick review. 1933, Chiang uses new tactics suggested by, it's just amazing to find out that there were even Germans who were down there providing military advice to the nationalist Chinese. But what you have is this odd situation. We have the Soviet Union, the United States, Western powers that are involved in China as before. This is an even better map for us to take a look at the Long March. The alliance between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong will break down. In the aftermath, there's a video I want to show you all. Here it is. Let me pick it up right here.
In the 1920s, under orders from Moscow, the communists collaborated with the nationalists in the struggle to turn China into a modern state. Both drew their support.
All have to vote early right now. Millions have already done it this year. It's a safe and easy way to vote. Don't wait till election day. 2020 isn't messing around, so neither should we.
Mostly from the cities. Mao concerned himself more with the peasants, starting with those of his own province of Hunan. When Chiang Kai-shek turned on the communists in the cities and killed them by the thousands, Mao was in the countryside, forming the nucleus of a peasant army, which would eventually carry him to supreme power.
I think the key factor in all of Mao's life, really, was his constant tendency to leave the center of action. When Chiang Kai-shek turned on the communists, Mao was not in Shanghai or Canton or any of the places where the action was. He was already back in Hunan.
For a century, China had been virtually defenseless against foreign powers. Her armies were too poor, her people too miserable, her leaders too feeble and corrupt. But no foreign power relished the idea of trying to run the whole of China and take responsibility for her wretched plight. The world powers sought prize pickings only from China's misfortunes. The most rapacious of them was Japan. Since the end of the 19th century, Japan had been extending control over outlying portions of the old Chinese Empire. As China drifted further into chaos, the Japanese army became increasingly aggressive on the mainland of China. Western powers tried to protect their interests with their own troops. But before the outbreak of the Second World War, they made no commitment to come to China's assistance. As the danger of war loomed in Europe, China was left wide open to the depredations of the Japanese. Chiang succeeded in maintaining control over his own forces, but Mao and his fellow communists were on the point of collapse.
Well, during the time when these dramatic events were going on, Mao was deep in the countryside in Jiangxi province, having beaten off a number of efforts by Chiang Kai-shek to liquidate this very large and growing area of communist settlement. And he had practically no contact with any kind of international events. His principal fight in those years was for his own authority.
By following his own line and not the one dictated by Stalin, Mao was virtually cut off from communist headquarters. Chiang retained Russian support and chose to deal with Mao's peasant stronghold before meeting the outside aggressor.
When Chiang Kai-shek finally got a German military advisor in, because this was a growing menace to him, this widening communist area, the military advisor worked out a strategy whereby they would gradually move in all around the edges of Mao's territory. He realized that he couldn't really fight with him.
So that covers some territory we've already talked about, but I just wanted to emphasize again that a dominant feature, a consistent feature of China's history in the late 19th century into the 20th century was internal discord, internal division, and almost unceasing, relentless conflict between the warlords with Mao Zedong, who sometimes maybe supported Chiang Kai-shek, oftentimes they did not, and of course between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. Throw in foreign powers, because before World War II, the Americans had in China what they called a river patrol boat, not squadron, but they had river patrol boats that set up, for example, a situation called the Panay incident, where a Japanese aircraft strafed the Panay, P-A-N-A-Y, that made the headlines back in the United States, but the United States issued letters of diplomatic protest, but that was it. However, it was a foreshadowing of the difficulties that America was going to eventually have with the Japanese in the Pacific War. Now, in 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek is forced off the mainland of China onto Formosa, today we know it as Taiwan. That is the period where Mao Zedong is going to begin trying to consolidate power on the mainland. Now, even though the communists have won, they're not in complete control of mainland China. After all, it is a big, big country. Consider that the following year, on June 25th, 1950, the North Koreans will invade South Korea. I'm not going to get too deep into that because we have another great presenter who's going to look at the Korean War. But in 1950, when that happens, of course, the world reacts. And the United States gets permission from the UN or goes to the UN, and through a vote in which the Soviet ambassador is not there, the decision is made to respond to the North Korean invasion with military force. Now, we understand today it was a police action. General MacArthur will leave the forward base at Japan and stage a counterattack, a landing at Incheon, which will cut off the North Korean advance and force them to double back from the Pusan perimeter north toward the 38th parallel. And the attack is going so well that American forces will begin pushing above the 38th parallel and going toward the Yalu River, which is the contiguous or shared border between North Korea and China. It's that threat that the Chinese feel from the American presence there in the war that moves the Chinese to communicate through an Indian diplomatic personnel through back channels, that if they don't stop threatening the Chinese mainland, China will come in on the side of the North Koreans, which is exactly what happened. The war that many people thought was going to be over by December ended up extending into 1951, 1952, and 1953. Mao Zedong could not allow those American forces or that war to get any closer because it threatened him consolidating power, consolidating his hold over mainland China. So he backed the North Koreans for both foreign policy reasons of the Chinese, but also to make sure that the communist internal control of mainland China would not be lost and give him a chance to implement all the other measures that he had thought about. For a brief period of time in the 1950s, there will be something called the Sino-Soviet Alliance, the Chinese-Soviet Alliance. But Stalinism and Maoism, as time went on, we're starting to go farther and farther apart. Joseph Stalin will die in 1953. The person that replaces him is Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. And even less so than Stalin, Mao will be of a mindset to go its own way with its own brand of communism, not so much what Khrushchev has in mind, particularly when Khrushchev begins to deconstruct the history of Stalin and to begin criticizing some of the things that Stalin had done. And there have been a number of things for which one could have criticized Stalin for. But that very brief alliance between Mao's China and the Soviet Union under Stalin first, and then Khrushchev, it broke apart. And the Sino-Soviet alliance, although they will still support the North Koreans, both nations will, although they both will support communist Vietnamese in the Vietnam War, for the most part, what happens in China, as far as policy, as far as the type of communism that's going to be practiced, is similar to, but very different from the type of communism practiced in Russia. To understand China today, I think, in the 21st century, we have to take into account that long period of foreign domination, and that long period where the Chinese were sometimes referred to as the sick man of Asia, where you had the national pride that was wounded, where they were determined to have no foreign influence, to see themselves as a world power. We should not underestimate that desire by people to have national pride, because that same desire for national pride is not only but one of the things that led to the rise of Nazi Germany. And it is one of those things that has people in Russia today pining for the good old days of the Soviet Union, when they were a world power that they felt was truly respected. They think that they've lost some of that power now. And when people try to get that back, it can make things very difficult or dangerous for people in their neighborhood. And right now, there are reports of the Chinese they're doing a lot of things in Africa. They're putting a lot of investment in Africa and the African continent. And America's historically poor relationship with the continent has to be revisited, because it is still full of too many people, too many young people. And Africa is seen by many historians and many economists as being a continent that will, by the mid part of the century, be a dominant force. And the Chinese are ahead of us as far as their influence in Africa. I'll go ahead and stop right there. I hope this has given us a good foundation to understand the very chaotic politics that existed inside of China at the end of World War II and before World War II, and which led to the rise of Mao Zedong, the dominance of the CCP, the Communist Chinese, and where the nationalist Chinese were forced off the mainland to Taiwan, where they are residing today. And America has to navigate between this two China policy, between Taipei, Taiwan, and Beijing, not to mention all the issues that have to go on with Hong Kong. I'll take your questions now.
Mute yourself and we can start asking questions.
I think you froze up, Peg.
Next time that you come out to the museum, I'm going to send one of the reasons that it's there, and people question, why would we have this ship, a model, a very beautiful hand-done model that is probably 6 feet long. And it's in our area where we highlight a lot of the air war, where we have the Civil Air Patrol during World War II. We talk about several people from our own communities, contributions, and we have this Chinese junk. And everyone's like, well, why is it there? Well, when you go in, you'll find out that during Doolittle's raid on China, the plan was for all of them to fly to China, Doolittle's raid on Japan, on Tokyo. Their plan was at the end to fly to China. Some of them made it, some of them did not. When Doolittle went down, he needed to find alternative transportation back to the rendezvous point. And he was lucky with some ranches and sailed him down the river so that he could meet up with his group of other survivors so that they could get back to their point, their rendezvous point. So next time you're in the museum, hunt out this Chinese junk that we have And it's an amazing vessel. And you can see how small that his raid had been captured by the Japanese, how different our own history would have ended up being that way.
Yeah.
So, but
You know,
just, so next time, come and hunt it down and find it.
there's a great book on the Doolittle raid about one of the people.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
There's a great book on the Doolittle raid. It's entitled 30 Seconds Over Tokyo by one of the Doolittle raiders. And this guy took him, he did make it to China, but it took him like close to 2, almost 3 years to make it back to the United States. But it's a wonderful story. A movie was made out of it starring Van Johnson. And in addition to it being a great war story, it's a great love story too, because the thing that keeps this guy going is the idea of getting back to his wife.
It was Ted Lawson who wrote the book.
Right.
Yep.
That's exactly right.
As a matter of fact, his flight engineer on his B-25, the ruptured duck, just died this year. He was the last surviving Doolittle raider.
Really? Did not know that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Wonderful presentation again. Thank you, Fred.
Thanks. Thanks, Cliff. I appreciate it.
I have a question about the warlords in China. Now, as I understand it, after World War II, you covered the period between 1945 and 50. The warlords were very active in supporting Mao and his eviction of Chiang Kai-shek from the mainland.
Yes.
What was the relationship of Mao to the warlords when it came to putting troops into Korea to fight the Americans?
Now, you know what? I don't know that exactly, Cliff, but I can tell you this much. Based on how Mao Zedong became, he exercised ruthless control. Once he got in power, he exercised ruthless control over the communist apparatus. And so I'm just going to
Sure.
Anything that they would have done in opposition to him, because we know things like, for example, the Great Leap Forward, where Mao basically abolished private farming, and it created the biggest famine. I've read some accounts, it was the biggest famine in history, which is saying quite a lot when you consider all the famines in history. But Mao had this program for the kind of China that he wanted to see, purely communist. And so with that kind of rule, where a man, everything that he says goes, any sort of opposition going to find itself standing in front of a firing squad. So there's not a whole lot of democratic dickering back and forth about what decision should be made. But it's one of those questions about specifically about Mao's relationship with the warlords. I will look into that.
He probably would have put any warlords that opposed him, put them in front of the firing squad.
I cannot imagine him tolerating any kind of opposition.
Sure.
Because a part of the Great Leap Forward was where he invited opposition. He invited, like, for example, intellectuals in the country to come forward and give their criticisms of what they thought the communist regime was. Well, these people believed that they had the freedom to do that. But the moment that they came forward and A, exposed who they were, and B, rendered their criticism, they were taken out and gotten rid of.
That says a lot.
That says a lot. And that's, it's another reason why, as I told my students, look, communism sounds like a great idea theoretically, but it has proven to be a spectacular failure in every nation that's ever tried it. North Korea stands as a prime example today. Communist China, Vietnam, although you can argue that in Vietnam and in communist China, they have political communism, meaning a totalitarian government, but their economies have all the earmarks of looking more and more like a free market economy, or they're pretending to be. So there's a real strange dynamic going on, but there's no doubt that the political control is totalitarian, meaning they have total control over everything. So all the things that we take for granted, and when putting this program together, it just made me love American freedoms all the more. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, freedom of the press. You can't assume that in those countries. You cannot assume it. And if you do, it's a problem for you even today.
Very good. Is there a particular reason why Mao chose, I guess he chose Nanking as the capital. Why not Shanghai or one of the
You mean
major?
Beijing?
I'm sorry.
You mean Beijing?
Yes, Beijing. Well, yes. No, I'm backing up to pre-war. I guess that would be Chiang Kai-shek.
Yeah,
Chose
Why
Nanking as
why he
the
chose Nanjing?
yeah.
Good question. I got to find out.
Oh, okay. No particular reason other than maybe to
Nothing
stay
I can
away from the
check.
coast.
Although, when you consider where Mao was and Chiang Kai-shek, they both were choosing those areas that were most strategically beneficial for them to carry out their respective programs. Don't forget,
True.
this was an alliance of necessity, not one of desire.
True.
Chiang Kai-shek allied himself with Mao Zedong out of the need to put down the divisions being caused by the warlords. So they were making war with each other, which was inhibiting the process of creating a stable or unified China. So Mao and his power with the people was one thing that he could use in combination with the nationalists to bring the warlords into line, although the warlords never fully trusted Chiang Kai-shek. So it could have been as much of a strategic decision as it was anything else.
True. Very good.
Thanks. Other questions?
I have always loved Chinese history, and being for a long period of time. We go back to, the 5,000-year history. And
Yeah.
so when they lost their power, during the warlording period, the period of the colonialization, where all the spheres of influences were, that was just looked at as that they had a poor government,
Right.
and that it took them time to rebuild from the fighting from other ones. And if you look at Chinese history across the thing, a 30-year have faced resistance from internal things. And so many of the things that we look at as, they're down and they're out for the count. No, because they're continuous long history. They
Yes.
just look at it as just one small aspect of
That's
their.
right. That's right, Peg. And that's why I thought, that's why I thought it would be a good use for our time to take a look at that period of colonization and when foreign powers are establishing those spheres of influence. I think it's not just the fact that foreign powers establish spheres of influence. We need to also remember that, a good deal of colonization in Africa and in Asia, that those were not benign regimes of colonial. I mean, they were exploitative. They were racist in many cases. They denied people, cultural features that have been around for thousands of years. And so the reaction to that, in some cases, is still playing itself out. So when you see Chinese aggression, you see a nation that refuses to be reduced to second-class citizenship again, that's part of the legacy of the memory of that period before World War II. And of course, being dominated by the Japanese, the way the Japanese ruled, didn't help anything. I think I mentioned to you all before that the Japanese had a saying they wanted to establish the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. They said Asia for the Asians. What they really meant was Asia for the Japanese. And they treated the Chinese in the worst imaginable way. The Japanese army was so guilty of so many things in the way it treated other Asian people, not Japanese. And China bore the brunt of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. That means that ultimately Japan was the greatest colonizer of China among all the outsiders.
I often say that every group of people on Earth, on the African continent, what you have, Cliff, is that you have for example, other African kingdoms that were expansionist and imperial. They conquered other people and colonized as well. They moved into Southern Europe at one point in their history, and Native Americans did it in North America. So if you are somebody walking around the title of human being, that means you too are capable of doing some of the very things that we see as atrocities in history, which should give us pause about thinking too highly of ourselves. And when it comes to, casting moral stones. That's why we take the history where you find it and try to understand it and not make it be something that it wasn't.
There you go. Very good.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We look forward to the time when we can have everyone back at the museum together again. As we go forward, we're going to continue our series. We have several more weeks of this, and I look forward to seeing you.